Hi, this video deals with burial and mummification. So 9,000 years ago, when the Egyptians were Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, when it came to burying their dead, they used a very simple method of burial. So they went into the desert and they dug a hole in the hot sand. They popped in their deceased relative and they filled in the pit with hot sand. Now these hunter-gatherer tribes, which there were many all over Upper and Lower Egypt, lived in a certain area boundary where they would hunt and gather foods. And we think that when they came back and they found that these pits had been attacked by wild cats and dogs that lived in the desert, they needed to come up with better solutions to burying their relatives. So the next method of burial that we find in what we call the archaeological record, you would call timeland, what we would call the archaeological record, you would call a timeline. Okay, so we find in the archaeological record that the next method of burial that they used were baskets made out of papyrus reeds and date palm reeds. So they wove these baskets, they put their relatives in, and they buried them into the sandpit. Now, it did give a small degree of protection against wild cats and dogs. So they came up with another safer method of burial, which were big clay pots. Big clay pots with stopper lids. You put your relative inside the clay pot. They stand about this tall, this wide. Put them inside, you seal up the lids, you pop them into the sandpit. Now there is a very good degree of protection, but the problem is producing the pot. In the 21st century, we take manufactured goods for granted. They're very cheap for supply and purchase. But in ancient times, everything had to be manufactured by hand. So think of the processes that went into making a pot this wide and that tall. First of all, the clay had to be collected from the River Nile. Then you had to sift the clay to get the stones out, because in that raw clay there's lots of small stones that's involved in the river bed as well. That all has to be sifted out. Then you have to give it to a specialist, a potter, who painstakingly creates the pot. Then you have to fire the pot, the risky part of it. Something like 20% of the ancient Egyptians' ceramics failed in the kiln. So if you can imagine 2 cracks during the firing process. So these were very expensive objects. And again, it's because of the labour-intensive nature of producing them. So the next type of burial that they came up with were wooden boxes, wooden coffins, if you can call them that. They are very small. They're about this wide, this long, this deep. Now, to get a human being into one of these boxes, it would cause a lot of damage, breaking necks and bending arms and legs to squash them into these tiny boxes. But they did these things because they wanted to protect their relatives from these wild cats and dogs. Also, in the early phase, when they came back to these burials, sometimes we think that they found their relatives lying, that the sand had blown away and the relatives were lying there peacefully as if they were fast asleep. And we think that's where the origin of ancient Egyptian belief in an afterlife came from, sort of 9,000 years ago. Coming back on their tour and finding their relatives lying in these sand pits with the sand blown away, looking peaceful and restful. So we've got 4 processes here: the simple sand pit, the reed basket, the ceramic pot, and a wooden coffin. Now, all of these things, all of these items were in contact with the hot sand, which caused natural dehydration and led on to the process of mummification. But as we move through the timeline, we find that all these early methods had their drawbacks. They weren't absolutely secure. And as the Egyptians advanced from being Paleolithic hunter-gatherers into farming, what we call the Neolithic culture, the farmers, they wanted more cheaper, secure places to bury their relatives. So back to the sand pit, but this time they lined the pit with mud bricks. They supported the sand pit with mud brick walls. They popped in their relatives. Okay, there we go. And they built, well, sometimes they lined the top with a piece of date palm wood from a tree, and then on top of that they built a mud brick wall. Now, the good thing about this is the sand has contact with the mud bricks. So as the body leaks fluid, the mud brick floor would soak up those fluids. Because the tomb is completely sealed, the germs cannot corrupt the body in any way. They become suspended and go to sleep. Okay, but if you was an elite, you wanted to guarantee that your body wasn't corrupted, because there still is the risk of a mouse or rat producing a hole, and that hole will cause the germs to wake up and corrupt the body. So the elites wanted a guarantee that their bodies were uncorrupted. Okay, so that's where we think the process of mummification came from, the desire for the elites to have an incorruptible body. So how did they mummify bodies? Well, they cut roughly a 6-inch slit down the left-hand side, and from there they could access the liver, the kidneys and the lungs. Now, mummification technology developed across their timeline. So in the early days of pyramid building, they left the hearts in the body. Later on, they removed the hearts and then put them back in the body later on. Now, once you've removed those items, then the chest and especially the stomach area is going to collapse, and they wanted a body which was the same form as it was when it was alive. So once they removed those items, they put stuffings in here to support the chest and stomach cavity. Now, let's say you have been quite overindulgent in your life and you had a little bit extra, but in the afterlife you wanted a 6-pack. We have evidence that the embalmers actually pulled the excess from the front and stitched them to the back, okay, giving you a nice flat stomach for the rest of eternity. To access the brain, again, there's lots of myths in Egyptian archaeology, but what they used was a very, very long copper wire with a handle on the end of it. So they fed the copper wire inside the skull, and then with the wooden handle, just like this, they rolled it backwards and forwards, making the copper wire spin inside the skull, and then they would let the brain dribble out through the nasal cavity. So they broke the nose, fed in the copper wire, used the wooden handle, whisked up the brain inside the skull, and let it dribble out through the nose. The misinformation that they pulled the brain out using a hook, that's all newspaper stuff during the 1920s and 30s when Howard Carter found Tutankhamun's tomb, and the newspapers around the world wanted to create stories for their editors. And Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter only used one newspaper, which was the Times in London, to officially take their stories. So all these other newspapers in the world were making up funny stories just to send to their editor. So that's where the hook idea came from. If you look at your nose, it's tiny. Our brains are gigantic things. If you did try and attempt to pull your brain out through your nose, you rip off the front of the head. Okay, so that's a no-no. So now you know how they got the brain out of the body. Now, in the first Pyramid Age, there was an attempt for the elites, and especially the king, to get the moisture out of the body. And again, this again goes back to Tutankhamun's day. They didn't have bandages. You don't need to use a bandage on a dead body. They don't need to support broken arms. They're dead. They don't need to keep blood inside them or fluids. They're dead. So these were wrappings that looked like bandages, but they were wrappings, and they wrapped the bodies up. The legs, the arms, the head and the torso, and they're functionally there to soak up the moisture of the body. Later on in their history, during the times of Ramesses the Great, and before him Seti and Tutmosis, they had discovered a salt deposit at the Wadi Natron, and they worked out if you use a large quantity of this salt and covered the body underneath and over and inside the body, the salt would suck up the moisture coming out of the body and produce natural mummification. So the early attempt was to use bandages. Well, not bandages, wrappings. Now we're using the right term, wrappings. Remember that, I did that deliberately so you would remember. They are not bandages, they are wrappings, and they're there to do a function, to soak that moisture out of the skin and the body. Well, wrappings are quite thin, aren't they? And they're made out of linen, so you'd need lots of layers of wrappings. So when you got to the elites and the king, we're talking about 9 layers of wrappings. So let's think about how they made linen. Well, they grew a flax plant, and the flax plant grows for a whole year, and the farmer comes along and he cuts off the biggest leaves. Then he takes it back and he dries them. Then he takes those leaves to the market and he barters for other goods. Who is going to buy those leaves? Well, the weaver. The weaver then goes back to the workshop and splices all the flax into strands, dries them, and that's what they're going to weave to produce linen. Time consuming, very time consuming. Just making like 1 square meter, it's going to take time. It was like something that a lot of people did in the evening if they had the right kit. And the loom itself was very expensive because it was made out of wood, and wood was a very expensive product in a country that mainly has date palm leaves anyway. So linen was very expensive. So when they discovered this natron salt, it was a lot cheaper and more economical, and that's when it opened up mummification to the middle classes. So what we call from the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, mummification was just really for the elites and kings. And then during the New Kingdom, a new market opened up, the middle classes, because they discovered the natron salt. So you've dehydrated the body, you've rebuilt it, you needed to seal up this patch, this cut, to stop other spirits from getting inside your body. So a patch was placed. Sometimes it was made up of papyrus paper or leather, and it was sewn on the side to stop other spirits from getting inside your body. And it had the name of a god on there, Horus, to oversee, to protect the body. Now, let's think of their beliefs, what the ancient Egyptians believed and how they're thinking in the world. They believed that their gods were the stars, and that when the gods returned to Egypt, they returned to Egypt as spirits. And the only way that the gods could communicate with people was if they went inside different animals or statues that the Egyptians provided for them. So they believed in the form of shamanism, the belief of a spirit world. They believed that when an ancient Egyptian died, the physical body stayed on earth, but the spirit, left the body and journeyed to the afterlife. And that's why you needed your body to be mummified, uncorrupted. Because when daytime came, the Egyptian spirits had to return to Egypt. The Egyptian gods had to return to Egypt and live in the temples that the Egyptians built for them. In the case of Egyptian spirits, they would go back inside their mummified bodies. Now, the term mummy is Arabic. In modern history, when the Arabs in Egypt were breaking into tombs and they were after goods in the 19th century, when people were having their grand tours, they thought the embalming fluids on the linen was actually a poison, a bitumen, and that's why they called them mummy. So mummy is an Arabic word which means bitumen. The Egyptians never called these uncorruptible bodies mummies. They called them the mansion or houses of the Ka, because the spirit would go back inside the body during the hours of daytime, and then when night time came, they would leave their house of the Ka and journey back to the afterlife. So they never knew the world was round. In their world, their thinking, they thought the world was flat. So the stars are the gods. When daytime closes, the afterlife closes. And all the Egyptian spirits, including the gods, have to come back to Egypt. The gods go and live in their temples, which the Egyptians have built for them. And the ordinary Egyptians, including the elites and the kings, would go back inside their houses of their cars. Okay? So that is the development of burial to mummification. I hope it's been slightly enjoyable for you, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. Bye for now.